Let's begin with something uncomfortable but honest. The way people treat your time is rarely accidental. It's learned, and most of the time it's learned from you. Because before the world decides how much you're worth, you quietly decide first, not with words, with behavior, with how quickly you respond, with how often you cancel your own plans, with how easily you put your priorities on pause for someone else's convenience. And over time, a message is sent, not intentionally, but clearly. My time is flexible, my life can wait, I will adjust. And once that message is received, people don't question it. They simply act on it. We like to believe that being available makes us valuable, that if we show up enough, respond fast enough, help often enough, we'll be appreciated, that our worth will be recognized through our sacrifice. But value doesn't work that way. Think about anything you truly value in your life, something meaningful, something important, something irreplaceable. It's not endlessly available, it's not easy to access, and it's not treated casually. Value is closely tied to limits. And yet, when it comes to ourselves, we remove every limit and then wonder why we feel overlooked, drained, and invisible. The truth is, self-worth is not a feeling, it's a standard. It's not something you declare, it's something you demonstrate. Every time you drop what matters to you for what matters to someone else, you reinforce a belief, not just in them, but in yourself, that your time is negotiable. And when your time is negotiable, your presence becomes ordinary. This isn't about ego. It isn't about arrogance. And it certainly isn't about playing games. It's about alignment. When your actions don't align with your inner value, friction is created. And that friction shows up as resentment, burnout, and quiet frustration. You start doing things with a smile that you secretly resent. You say yes while hoping someone notices the sacrifice. You give, not from abundance, but from fear. Fear that if you don't stay available, you'll be forgotten. Fear that if you don't respond, you'll be replaced. Fear that if you don't give enough, you won't be enough. But here's the paradox most people miss. The more you chase value through availability, the further it moves away from you. Because people don't value what is always accessible. They value what is intentional. When someone values their own time, they don't need to announce it. It shows. They don't rush every response. They don't explain every absence. They don't apologize for being focused. And because they treat their time with care, others do too. This is not about becoming distant. It's about becoming deliberate. There's a difference between being generous and being available by default. Generosity is a choice. Availability without boundaries is a habit. And habits shape identity. If you repeatedly behave as if your time is less important, your mind starts to believe it. And once you believe it, you tolerate things you shouldn't. You stay longer than you should. You give more than you can afford. Not because others are forcing you, but because you've quietly agreed. Self-worth begins the moment you stop negotiating with yourself. The moment you say, "My time matters," even when no one is watching. The moment you choose to protect your focus without guilt. The moment you stop explaining why you're unavailable. The moment you realize that not everyone deserves immediate access to you. This can feel uncomfortable at first, even frightening, because when you change your availability, you change the rules. And people who benefited from the old rules will notice. Some will test you, some will question you, some will push back. Not because you're doing something wrong, but because you're doing something new. And here's the CRI. Title insight. The discomfort you feel when you start valuing yourself is not a sign of selfishness. It's a sign of growth. For the first time, your actions are catching up to your worth. You don't owe constant access to anyone. You don't owe instant replies. You don't owe emotional availability to people who don't respect your energy. What you owe is honesty with yourself. Ask yourself this: if your time truly mattered to you, would you still give it away so easily? Would you still answer every call? Would you still delay your dreams for someone else's urgency? Would you still live in reaction instead of intention? Because when you value yourself, availability becomes a decision, not a reflex. And that decision changes everything. Your focus sharpens, your energy stabilizes, your presence becomes meaningful again. People may see you less, but they feel you more. Because when you do show up, you're not resentful. You're present, you're grounded, you're intentional. That's power of self-worth. It doesn't demand attention. It commands respect. And it starts quietly, internally. In the moments no one applauds, when you choose yourself without needing validation, when you protect your time without explanation, When you stop proving your value and start living from it. Because the world doesn't decide your worth first. You do. And once you truly believe that your time is valuable, your availability changes and everything else follows. Most people don't struggle because they lack discipline. They struggle because they lack direction. And when you don't know exactly where your life is going, you make a subtle trade. You trade focus for approval. You trade progress for presence. You stay visible instead of being intentional. That's how over-availability begins. It rarely starts as a mistake. It starts as a desire to be useful, to be included, to matter. So you answer the message. You take the call. You show up, even when it pulls you away from, you said mattered most. And at first, it feels good. You feel needed. You feel wanted. You feel relevant. But relevance is not purpose. Purpose requires distance. It requires saying no to things that feel good in the moment so you can say yes to something meaningful in the long run. And that's where most people hesitate. Because being focused means being misunderstood. Being intentional means being unavailable. And being unavailable makes some people uncomfortable. So instead, we stay reachable. We stay responsive. We stay busy with other people's needs because it protects us from facing a harder question: what are we building with our own lives? Over-availability is often not generosity, it's avoidance. When you're constantly reacting, you don't have to decide. When you're always there for everyone else, you don't have to confront whether you're there for yourself. But life doesn't reward reaction. It rewards direction. Progress doesn't come from being everywhere. It comes from being somewhere specific. And that requires focus. Focus is not a productivity trick. It's a value statement. It says, this matters more than that. Every time you allow yourself to be interrupted without intention, you're making a statement, whether you realize it or not, that your future can wait. And futures don't grow in waiting rooms. They grow in quiet, in repetition, in absence from noise. That's why the most meaningful work often looks boring from the outside. It's not dramatic. It's not urgent. It doesn't demand attention. It demands commitment. And commitment means you can always be available. When you focus on your life, something interesting happens. The noise gets louder at first. The expectations increase. People start asking questions. Why didn't you reply? Why weren't you there? You've changed. And maybe you have, not because you care less, but because you care more about what you're building, more about where you're going, more about the limited time you've been given. Here's the truth most people avoid. Not everyone deserves the same level of access to you. Access is earned. It's built on respect, not convenience. When you give everyone the same access, you dilute your energy. You stretch yourself thin. And eventually you start showing up exhausted, resentful, and disconnected. That's not sustainable. And deep down you know it. A life of meaning requires seasons of unavailability. Moments where you are unreachable, not because you're hiding, but because you're growing. You can't build something significant if you're constantly interrupting yourself to reassure others. And reassurance is often what people are really asking for. Not your presence, not your help, but confirmation that they still matter. The problem is, you start providing that confirmation at the expense of your own life. You begin to exist in response mode, always answering, always adjusting, always available. And slowly, without realizing it, your goals become vague. Your ambition becomes quiet. Your direction becomes blurred. Not because you failed, but because you never protected it. Focus is fragile. It doesn't survive constant interruption. That's why you must defend it, even when it feels uncomfortable. Especially when it feels uncomfortable. Because the people who truly respect you will adapt. They won't demand immediate access. They won't punish your absence. They won't confuse your boundaries with rejection. They understand that a focused person is not a distant person. They're a committed one. And the people who don't understand, they were attached to your availability, not your growth. That's an important distinction. When you stop being overly available, some connections weaken, but the ones that remain get stronger. They become more honest, more intentional, more balanced, because they're no longer built on constant access. They're built on mutual respect, and respect changes the quality of every interaction. You show up less often, but more fully. You speak less, but with clarity. You give less, but with intention. That's what focus does. It sharpens everything. And here's the most important part. When you focus on your life, you give others permission to do the same. You model what it looks like to protect your time without guilt, to pursue something meaningful without constant explanation, to value yourself without apology. And that's leadership. Not the kind that stands on a stage, but the kind that lives in example. The kind that says, without words, your life deserves attention. So stop measuring your worth by how reachable you are. Stop equating busyness with importance. Stop confusing presence with progress. Your life is not meant to be lived in fragments. It's meant to be built with intention. And intention requires focus. Focus requires boundaries. Boundaries require courage. But on the other side of that courage is clarity. Clarity about who you are, clarity about what matters, clarity about where you're going. And once you have that, availability is no longer a weakness. It becomes a choice. And when you choose carefully, your life finally starts moving forward. There comes a moment in life when giving more no longer makes things better. It only makes them familiar. Familiarity is comfortable, but it's rarely transformative. And many people stay stuck not because they don't care, but because they care too much in the wrong direction. They give their time freely. They offer their energy without limits. They stay emotionally open long after it stops being healthy. And they call it loyalty. But loyalty without boundaries isn't strength. It's erosion. Because every time you overextend yourself, you don't disappear all at once. You fade slowly, quietly, until one day you realize you've been present in everyone else's life except your own. This doesn't happen overnight. It happens one small compromise at a time. You answer when you're tired, you stay when you should leave, you listen when you need silence, and you tell yourself it's temporary, that once things settle down, you'll refocus on yourself. But life doesn't settle down. It fills the space you give it. And when you don't protect that space, other people's needs move in permanently. The hardest truth for generous people to accept is this: being indispensable to everyone else often means being invisible to yourself. You become the reliable one, the always there one, the one people expect to bend. And expectations once formed become silent demands. People do, and to ask anymore. They assume you'll reply. They assume you'll help. They assume you'll wait, not because they're unkind, but because you've taught them to. Self-worth isn't about what you say, it's about what you tolerate. And tolerance shapes identity. If you tolerate constant interruption, your life becomes reactive. If you tolerate emotional overuse, your energy depletes. If you tolerate being taken for granted, your confidence erodes. Not dramatically, subtly. You start doubting yourself. You start questioning your value. You start wondering why you feel so tired despite doing the right thing. The exhaustion isn't physical. It's misalignment. You're giving from obligation instead of intention. There's a difference between choosing to show up and feeling obligated to stay accessible. Choice is empowering. Obligation is draining. And when obligation drives your availability, resentment follows close behind. You may never say it out loud, but you feel it. Quiet frustration, the unspoken anger, the sense that you're being used, even when no one asked you to. That resentment is not a flaw. It's a signal. It's your inner self saying, this isn't balanced anymore. The challenge is that many people ignore that signal because they're afraid of what honoring it would require. It would require disappointing others. It would require changing patterns. It would require saying no without justification. And that feels risky. Because when you change how available you are, you change how people relate to you. Some will adapt, some will resist, some will leave. And that's where clarity comes in. Not everyone who leaves was meant to stay. Some connections survive only when you overgive. Some relationships function only when you overextend. Some dynamics exist because you're willing to shrink. But growth doesn't happen in those spaces. Growth happens when you allow discomfort to replace familiarity. When you let silence replace constant communication, when you let distance replace emotional dependency, when you let boundaries replace exhaustion. Boundaries are not punishments, they're definitions. They define what you value, they define what you protect, they define who you're becoming. And people take those definitions seriously, even when they don't like them. You don't need to announce your boundaries, you don't need to defend them, you don't need to explain your absence. You simply live differently. You respond slower. You say no more often. You stop filling every gap with your presence. And something powerful happens. Your life begins to regain shape. Your time feels like it belongs to you again. Your energy returns because it's no longer scattered. Your confidence grows because your actions align with your worth. You stop chasing appreciation and start living with self-respect. And here's the surprising part. The right people don't pull away when you value yourself. They lean in. They respect the clarity. They adjust their expectations. They engage with you more intentionally. Because healthy relationships don't depend on constant access. They depend on mutual respect. And respect grows when you stop being endlessly available. This isn't about becoming cold or distant. It's about becoming whole. When you are whole, you don't need to overgive to feel worthy. You don't need to be needed to feel important. You don't need constant connection to feel secure. You show up because you choose to, not because you're afraid not to. And that choice changes everything. Your presence becomes meaningful instead of habitual. Your help becomes generous instead of expected. Your relationships become balanced instead of draining. Most importantly, you begin living your life from the inside out. Not reacting to every request, not bending to every expectation, not disappearing into everyone else's needs. You reclaim your direction, and direction is what turns effort into progress. So if you feel exhausted despite giving so much, it's not because you're weak, it's because you're ready to value yourself, ready to protect your energy, ready to stop being endlessly available, not to push people but to finally make space for the life that's been waiting for your attention all along. There is a quiet misunderstanding about respect that many people never question. They believe respect is something you earn by doing more, giving more, and being there more often. So they show up early, stay late, and remain available long after it cost them their peace. They think consistency of presence creates value. But what actually creates value is consistency of principle. People don't respect you because you are always there. They respect you because you stand for something even when it's inconvenient. When you don't stand for yourself, you teach others not to stand for you either, not intentionally, not maliciously, but gradually through patterns that repeat until they feel normal. Respect begins long before anyone else is involved. It begins in private, in the small decisions you make when no one is watching. When you choose rest instead of responding immediately, when you protect your time instead of apologizing for being busy, when you follow through on commitments to yourself with the same seriousness you give to others. Every time you break a promise to yourself, something weakens. Not on the outside, but inside. And when that happens enough times, people can sense it. They may not articulate it, but they respond to it. Because confidence is not declared. It's detected. This is why boundaries are so misunderstood. They're seen as selfish, rigid, or unnecessary. But boundaries are simply evidence that you respect your own life. And self-respect is the foundation of all other respect. Without it, you become flexible in the wrong ways. You bend when you should be firm. You adjust when you should be focused. You compromise when you should be committed. And over time, people begin to treat your priorities as optional because you do. It's not that people are intentionally dismissive. They're responding to the standards you set. Standards are not rules. Give others. They're rules you live by. When your standards are unclear, expectations fill the gap, and expectations, once formed, are hard to undo. So people expect immediate replies, they expect constant access, they expect emotional availability on demand. And when you finally push back, it feels dramatic. Not because it is, but because it's overdue. This is why valuing yourself often feels like conflict. It interrupts a pattern that benefited others more than it benefited you. But growth always disrupts comfort. When you stop being overly available, you're not rejecting people, you're redefining the relationship. And redefinition is uncomfortable for those who preferred the old version of you. Some will interpret your boundaries as distance. Some will see them as change. Some will call it selfishness. But what they're really reacting to is loss of control. Control over your time. Control over your energy. Control over your responsiveness. And control, once removed, reveals the true nature of the connection. Healthy connections adapt. Unhealthy ones resist. This is where clarity becomes your anchor. You don't need to convince anyone of your value. You need to live it consistently. Consistency is what turns boundaries into respect. Not a single no, but repeated alignment. Not one absence, but intentional presence. You begin showing up when it matters, not when it's expected. You give your best energy to what aligns, not what demands. You stop negotiating with yourself to keep others comfortable. And slowly something shifts. People stop questioning your availability and start respecting your time. They stop assuming access and start appreciating it. They stop leaning on you out of habit and start engaging with you out of intention, because intention changes the quality of connection. When you're no longer everywhere, your presence carries weight. When you're no longer always reachable, your words carry meaning. When you're no longer endlessly flexible, your commitments carry trust. This isn't about power. It's about integrity. Integrity is when your inner values and outer behavior match. And when they do, people feel safe around you. They know where you stand. They know what to expect. And that clarity builds respect far more effectively than overgiving ever could. It also builds self-trust. When you honor your time, you trust yourself more. When you protect your energy, you feel grounded. When you follow through on your priorities, your confidence stabilizes. You stop seeking validation through usefulness. You stop measuring worth through responsiveness. You stop confusing being needed with being respected, because respect doesn't come from availability. It comes from alignment. And alignment changes how you live. You choose your commitments carefully. You invest deeply instead of widely. You value quality of connection over quantity of interaction. And in doing so, you send a message without saying a word, my life. matters. That message doesn't push people away, it attracts the right ones. The ones who don't need constant reassurance, the ones who don't confuse access with intimacy, the ones who respect focus, ambition, and growth. These are the relationships that last, because they're built on mutual respect, not emotional dependency. So if you're tired of feeling taken for granted, the answer isn't to give more. It's to value yourself enough to give differently, with intention, with boundaries, with consistency, because the moment you stop being endlessly available, you don't lose respect. You finally start earning it from others and from yourself. There is a quiet fear that keeps many people stuck in patterns they've outgrown. It's not the fear of failure. It's not even the fear of rejection. It's the fear that if they stop giving so much, they will be left behind. So they stay available. They stay agreeable. They stay reachable. Not because it's healthy, but because it feels safe. And for a while, it works. People stay close. Messages keep coming. Invitations keep arriving. You feel connected. You feel included. But inclusion is not the same as belonging. Belonging doesn't require constant effort. It doesn't demand proof. It doesn't disappear the moment you step back. Belonging is rooted in authenticity. And authenticity can't survive when you're always performing usefulness. When you overgive to maintain connection, you're not building relationships, you're managing them. You're managing expectations, you're managing emotions, you're managing how others perceive you. And management is exhausting. The reason it's exhausting is because it's fragile. It depends on your constant presence, your constant responsiveness, your constant availability. The moment you pause, you worry something will break. But the truth is, anything that breaks when you stop overgiving was never stable to begin with. Real connection doesn't collapse under boundaries. It clarifies. When you begin to value yourself, when you pull your energy back and invest it more intentionally, something important is revealed. The right people don't disappear. They remain. They don't punish your absence. They don't guilt you for your growth. They don't demand access as proof of loyalty. They adjust. They understand. They respect. Because their connection to you isn't transactional, it's relational. This is where most people get surprised. They expect distance to create loss. They expect boundaries to create rejection. They expect focus on self to create isolation. But what actually happens when done with integrity is the opposite. The shallow connections fade. The convenient relationships weaken. The ones built on dependency lose relevance. And what remains is smaller but stronger, fewer conversations, deeper understanding, less noise, more meaning. That's not loneliness. That's alignment. Alignment is when your relationships match the life you're trying to buoy. Not everyone can come with you into the next version of yourself. Not because they're bad people, but because they were connected to an older version of you that no longer fits. Growth changes the terms of connection. And when you grow, the people who are meant to grow with you will find a way to stay. They don't cling, they don't compete, they don't demand you shrink to make them comfortable. They meet you where you are. And here's the key insight. The people who leave when you stop being overly available were not attached to you. They were attached to your availability. That distinction matters because it removes guilt. You didn't abandon them. You didn't change unfairly. You didn't become cold. You became honest. Honest about your limits. Honest about your priorities, honest about the life you want to build. And honesty is the foundation of all healthy connection. When you stop being too available, you start showing up as your full self, not the version of you that insists to serve, soothe, or support at your own expense. You bring clarity into your relationships. You communicate with intention instead of obligation. You give from choice instead of fear. You connect from wholeness instead of need. That's when relationships stop draining you and start strengthening you. And the irony is, when you value yourself, you actually become more generous, not less. Because generosity rooted in self-respect has limits. And limits make generosity sustainable. You can show up without resentment. You can help without exhaustion. You can listen without losing yourself. You stop giving everything to everyone and start giving the right things to the right people. That's maturity. It's understanding that not all connections are equal, and they don't need to be. Some people get your time, some get your support, some get your kindness from a distance, and all of that is okay, because balance is not exclusion. It's wisdom. When you no longer fear being left, you stop chasing belonging. And when you stop chasing, you finally experience it. Belonging is not something you earn by being endlessly available. It's something you experience when you are fully yourself. And being fully yourself requires courage. The courage to disappoint, the courage to be misunderstood, the courage to let go of connections that no longer align. But on the other side of that courage is freedom. Freedom from over-explaining, freedom from over-giving, freedom from living in reaction to other people's needs. You start living deliberately. You choose your connections with care. You invest where there is mutual respect. You build relationships that support the life you're creating, not the life you're escaping. And that's when something powerful happens. You realize you were never meant to be available to everyone. You were meant to be present where it matters. And the people who truly belong in your life will recognize the difference and stay. At some point, growth stops being about adding more and starts being about letting go. Letting go of habits that no longer serve you. Letting go of expectations that were never yours to carry. Letting go of the belief that your value is measured by how much you give away. The truth is, your life was never meant to be lived on constant standby. You were not designed to be endlessly accessible, endlessly accommodating, or endlessly available at the expense of your own direction. You were designed to live with intention. When you value yourself, everything changes, not all at once, but steadily. Your time becomes purposeful. Your energy becomes focused. Your relationships become honest. You stop reacting to every demand and start responding to what truly matters. This doesn't make you distant. It makes you present. Presence is not about being everywhere. It's about being fully engaged where you choose to be. And choice is the difference between living deliberately and living in reaction. As you begin to protect your time, you will notice resistance. Some people won't understand. Some will question your change. Some may drift away. Let them, because what remains will be real. The connections that survive your boundaries are the ones worth keeping, the ones that respect your focus, your growth, and your self-respect. Those are not relationships built on convenience or dependency. They are built on alignment. You don't need to announce your worth. You demonstrate it by how you live, by what you prioritize, by what you no longer tolerate, by choosing your life even when it's uncomfortable. And yes, it will feel uncomfortable at first, because choosing yourself disrupts old patterns. But discomfort is not a warning. It's confirmation that you're evolving. You will find that when you stop being too available, you gain something far more valuable than approval. You gain clarity. You gain confidence. You gain control over the one thing you can never get back, your time. And in that clarity, your purpose has room to grow. You begin showing up not because you're needed, but because you choose to. You give not because you're afraid to lose people, but because it aligns with who you are. You connect not to be accepted, but to belong. This is where real self-worth lives, not in words, not in validation, but in action. So take your life seriously, protect your focus, honor your energy, build boundaries that reflect your values, because when you finally stop being endlessly available, you don't lose yourself, you find yourself. And that is where everything truly begins.